Officer Ethan Cole has always sought solace in the quiet order of his work, a refuge from the chaos of his past. But when a long shift ends with a baby's cry from a dumpster, everything changes. The infant he rescues, Grace, soon becomes more than a fleeting concern. She becomes the center of his world. However, a routine DNA test reveals an impossible truth. Grace is biologically his daughter. Haunted by the memory of his fiancée, Natalie, and the life they were supposed to build together, Ethan is thrust into a web of secrets he never imagined. As he uncovers the shocking truths about Natalie's hidden past and the twisted circumstances surrounding Grace's birth, Ethan is forced to confront a betrayal that could tear his fragile world apart. Now, caught between his love for Grace and the devastating truths that unravel around him, Ethan must fight for his daughter and his own sense of identity. In this gripping tale of love, destiny, and unimaginable betrayal, Shadows of Fate will keep you on the edge of your seat until the final, heart-wrenching twist. Will Ethan find the strength to protect the daughter he never knew he had? Or will the past destroy the future he's fighting for? Ethan Cole rubbed his eyes as he packed up his things at the precinct. The night had been uneventful but draining. Another shift, another set of hours spent trying to outrun the memories of Natalie. Her smile, her laugh, everything still haunted him. He zipped up his jacket and nodded goodbye to his colleagues as he stepped out into the cold, early morning air. The streets were quiet, his footsteps echoing off the brick buildings as he walked to his car. "You're working too much, Cole," his partner, Sarah, had told him earlier in the night. "It's not healthy." "I'm fine," he had responded, not entirely convincing himself. Now, as he walked down the alley that led to his apartment complex, Ethan wondered if maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he had been burying himself in work to avoid facing the loneliness that consumed him. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he turned the corner and froze. A faint cry reached Ethan's ears, so soft he almost missed it. He hesitated, thinking it might be a stray animal. But then he heard it again, a baby's cry. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward the sound, eyes scanning the dark alley. There, next to a rusted dumpster, he saw a small bundle wrapped in a dirty floral blanket. Ethan crouched down, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the bundle was a tiny baby girl, no more than a few weeks old, her face red from crying. Hey, it's okay," Ethan whispered, gently lifting the baby into his arms. She was cold, her cries growing softer now that she was held. He looked around, but there was no one. Who would leave a baby like this? "I've got you," he said, holding her closer as he fumbled for his phone. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." The hospital was buzzing with the usual chaos as Ethan carried the baby inside. A nurse quickly guided him to a room where a doctor took the infant from his arms and began examining her. "She's stable," the doctor said after a few minutes. "No injuries, just a bit cold and dehydrated. We'll get her warmed up and hydrated." Ethan stood by the door, watching. His hands trembled slightly. He had seen some terrible things in his career, but nothing had shaken him like this. The idea that someone could abandon a helpless baby in the cold. "Do you know who she belongs to?" the nurse asked gently, pulling him from his thoughts. Ethan shook his head. "No, I found her in a dumpster." The words felt bitter on his tongue. The nurse glanced at the baby and back at him. "You did the right thing bringing her here. Social services will take over, and we'll start looking for her parents." Ethan nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. There was something about this baby girl, something that tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. Ethan returned home, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the baby girl he had found. Grace. That's what he had mentally named her during the drive to the hospital. It suited her. The following morning, he found himself pacing his small apartment, unable to shake the thought of Grace being passed through the system. He had seen enough cases where children got lost in the bureaucracy. He couldn't let that happen to her. Pulling out his phone, Ethan dialed the number for social services. "This is Officer Ethan Cole," he said, his voice firm. "I'd like to foster the baby I found." There was a pause on the other end. "Officer Cole, fostering a child is a big decision. You'll need to go through the proper procedures, background checks." "I know," Ethan interrupted, his heart racing. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. A week later, Ethan sat in a small office at the hospital, waiting for the routine DNA test results required for the foster care application. Grace had been staying with him in temporary foster care, and he was already growing attached. She was his reason to get up in the morning, her soft coos filling the silence of his apartment. "Officer Cole?" A nurse called from the door. "The DNA results are in." Ethan stood, nerves tightening in his chest. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. "There's been a development," the nurse said, glancing down at the file in her hands. "The DNA test. It shows that the baby is biologically yours." Ethan blinked, the words not registering at first. "That's impossible," he stammered. "I haven't." "I understand," the nurse replied gently, "but the results are clear. She's your daughter." The room seemed to spin as Ethan sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. How could this be? How was Grace his daughter when he hadn't been in a relationship since Natalie? The shock of the revelation left him speechless, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt completely lost. Ethan sat in the hospital's waiting room, staring blankly at the DNA results in his hands. The words blurred as he tried to process the impossible revelation. Grace was biologically his. But how? He hadn't been in a relationship since Natalie. The nurse's voice echoed in his head, but nothing made sense. "There must be a mistake," he muttered under his breath. He stood up abruptly, startling Grace, who was in her carrier beside him. A doctor approached. "Officer Cole, I know this is shocking, but we've run the test twice. The results are accurate." Ethan shook his head. "No, I need it done again." "This isn't possible." His voice cracked, his frustration growing. He could feel the room spinning, his mind racing for an explanation. "Ethan," the doctor said gently, "we'll do it again if you want, but I promise you, the results won't change." Ethan didn't respond. He grabbed Grace's carrier and left the hospital, the weight of the truth pressing on his chest like a heavy stone. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could help him find them. Later that day, Ethan found himself at the precinct, his head buried in his hands at his desk. He barely noticed when Sarah sat across from him, her brow furrowed in concern. "Ethan, you look like you've seen a ghost." "What's going on?" she asked, leaning forward. He looked up, eyes wide and filled with confusion. "Grace, she's biologically mine. The DNA test, it says she's my daughter." Sarah blinked in surprise, her mouth opening but no words coming out at first. "Wait, what? How's that possible?" "I don't know," Ethan exclaimed, slamming his hand on the desk. "I haven't been with anyone since Natalie, and now they're telling me this baby is mine." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to process the information. "Okay, we need to figure this out. Could it be a mistake?" "I demanded another test, but they're sure the results are accurate," Ethan said, his voice shaking with frustration. "I don't know what to do." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Maybe you need to look into Natalie's past. She might have done something we didn't know about." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed to Sarah's suggestion. It had been years since he stepped into Natalie's old apartment, and now, as he stood outside the door, his heart pounded. He had avoided this place, the memories too painful, but now he had no choice. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, the apartment frozen in time, Natalie's belongings exactly where she had left them. He walked slowly, his fingers brushing over the framed photos of them together, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. They had been happy once. Ethan moved to her desk, opening drawers and sifting through papers, his heart heavy with every memory that surfaced. As he dug deeper, he found an old envelope addressed to Natalie. His hand trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter from a fertility clinic, dated shortly before her death. Ethan's stomach dropped. Natalie had gone to a fertility clinic? Why hadn't she told him? Ethan sat on the floor of Natalie's apartment, the letter in his hand. His mind raced as he reread the words over and over. Natalie had visited a fertility clinic. But why? What had she been planning? And why had she kept it from him? He pulled out his phone and dialed the clinic's number, his hand shaking as he waited for someone to pick up. "Hello, this is Dr. Walter's office," a receptionist answered. Hi, this is Officer Ethan Cole. I'm calling about my fiancée, Natalie Pierce. She came to your clinic a few years ago, he said, his voice tense. Let me check, the receptionist replied, the sound of typing in the background. Yes, I see her records here. Would you like to schedule an appointment with Dr. Walters? Yes, Ethan said immediately. As soon as possible. Hanging up the phone, Ethan felt a surge of anger and confusion. What had Natalie been hiding? And how did it connect to Grace? The next day, Ethan sat across from Dr. Walters at the fertility clinic. The doctor looked at him with a calm professionalism that only made Ethan more anxious. Natalie came to see us about fertility treatments, Dr. Walters explained. She was exploring her options, but we never completed any procedures. She didn't return after the initial consultation. Ethan frowned. Why would she have come to you without telling me? We were planning a life together. Dr. Walters hesitated before responding. I can't speak to her personal reasons, but some patients explore fertility options without telling their partners, especially if there are underlying concerns. Ethan leaned forward, his frustration growing. But how does this explain the DNA test? How is Grace my daughter? Dr. Walters paused, choosing his words carefully. It's possible that someone used your genetic material without your knowledge. I would suggest looking into any medical procedures you or Natalie may have undergone that could explain this. Ethan left the clinic, his mind reeling. Someone had used his genetic material? The idea seemed absurd, but nothing about this situation made sense anymore. He needed to dig deeper. There were more secrets to uncover. Ethan walked into the clinic, his heart heavy with questions. The receptionist greeted him warmly and directed him to Dr. Walters' office. As he waited, he replayed the phone conversation in his mind. The word fertility still didn't make sense in the context of his relationship with Natalie. They had never even discussed children. Dr. Walters, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, entered the room and sat across from him. Officer Cole, I understand you're here regarding your fiancée, Natalie Pierce, he began. Ethan nodded, leaning forward. Yes, I found a letter. She came here. But why? What was she doing here? Dr. Walters adjusted his glasses. Natalie was exploring fertility options. She wanted to discuss procedures that could help her conceive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What? We were never trying for a child. She came in for a consultation, but nothing beyond that. She didn't pursue any treatments. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. Why wouldn't she have told me? I don't understand. I can't speak to her reasons, Officer Cole, Dr. Walters said gently, but it seems she had some doubts or concerns that may have led her to seek options. Ethan left the clinic, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. Natalie had been hiding something. But what? Back at his apartment, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fertility clinic's pamphlet he had taken with him. Could Natalie have been planning to have a child without him knowing? The thought made his stomach churn. He clenched his fists, frustration building. What were you hiding, Natalie? He muttered to himself. His phone buzzed, and he saw a text from Sarah. Anything from the clinic? Ethan texted back. She went there. But no procedures. Just consultations. Sarah replied quickly. Maybe she didn't go through with it. Or maybe she had other plans. Ethan frowned, unsure of what to think. Could it be that Natalie had planned something behind his back? And how did Grace fit into all of this? His mind spiraled with possibilities, none of them comforting. He needed answers, but the more he searched, the deeper the mystery became. Ethan met with Sarah the next morning at a coffee shop near the precinct. He hadn't slept, his mind buzzing with too many questions and no answers. Sarah could tell something was off the moment she saw him. You look like hell, she said, sliding him a coffee. Rough night? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. I can't shake this, Sarah. What if Natalie was hiding more than I thought? What if she had a baby and didn't tell me? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. You think she secretly had a child? I don't know, Ethan muttered. But Grace, she's mine. The DNA test proves it. What if Natalie did something I wasn't aware of? Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Ethan, don't jump to conclusions. Natalie loved you. Maybe she had her reasons, but that doesn't mean she would have done something like that. Ethan nodded, though doubts still gnawed at him. I need to know the truth. Whatever it is. Sarah sighed. We'll figure this out. We'll find the answers. But don't let the fear of what you don't know tear you apart. Later that night, as Ethan sat on his couch with Grace asleep in her crib, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Is this Officer Ethan Cole?" A distorted voice asked on the other end. Ethan's heart raced. "Who is this?" "I know about Natalie. I know what she did." Ethan stood, adrenaline coursing through him. "What are you talking about?" The voice hesitated before continuing. "She kept secrets, Officer Cole. Big ones. You don't know the half of it." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you know? Tell me." But the line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone in disbelief, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. Someone knew more than they were letting on, and now the pieces of the puzzle were becoming even more twisted. Ethan couldn't sleep that night, the phone call replaying in his mind. He had to go back to Natalie's apartment. He had to search for more answers. There had to be something he missed. He arrived at the apartment early the next morning, the familiar sadness washing over him as he stepped inside. This time, he was more thorough, pulling open drawers, searching every corner. Then, tucked beneath a pile of old clothes in the back of a closet, he found it, a small, leather-bound diary. Ethan's hands shook as he opened it. The first few pages were filled with typical entries, her love for him, their future plans. But then, the tone shifted. The last entry caught his eye. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought this would be the right thing to do. But now, I'm not so sure." Ethan sat down, staring at the words. What had Natalie been struggling with? What decision had she made without telling him? And how did it lead to Grace? Ethan sat in Natalie's old apartment, the pages of her diary trembling in his hands. The final entry was a jarring contrast to the earlier ones, full of guilt and fear. She had written about a decision that could change everything. "I thought it was the right thing to do, but I don't know anymore. I wish I could tell Ethan, but I'm scared of losing him. I never imagined it would end like this." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What had Natalie done? Why hadn't she trusted him enough to tell him? His mind swirled with possibilities, but nothing made sense. He had always thought they shared everything. Now, it seemed as if she had kept something monumental hidden. He needed answers, and fast. He grabbed his phone and called Sarah. "I found her diary," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "There's more to this, Sarah. I need help." The next day, Sarah and Ethan sat across from a woman who claimed to be an old friend of Natalie's. Her name was Kara, and she had reached out after hearing about Natalie's death and Ethan's search for answers. "She came to me when she was desperate," Kara explained, nervously twisting a bracelet on her wrist. "She didn't know what to do. She told me about the surrogacy arrangement." Ethan froze. "Surrogacy? What are you talking about?" Kara nodded. "She entered into an agreement with a couple. They wanted a baby, and Natalie needed the money. But something went wrong. I'm not sure what, but she backed out. I think she regretted it." Ethan's mind raced. "Are you saying Grace is the result of that surrogacy deal?" Kara hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible." Ethan paced the floor of his apartment, trying to wrap his mind around the revelation. Natalie had entered a surrogacy agreement and never told him. Why? What had driven her to such a desperate decision? And why had she abandoned the plan? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Sarah. "You okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Ethan shook his head. "No, I don't know what to think. How could Natalie keep this from me?" Sarah sat down beside him. "Maybe she was trying to protect you. She clearly regretted whatever decision she made. It's possible she didn't know how to tell you." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling over. "I thought I knew her. I thought we were building a life together. Now, I find out she was doing all of this behind my back." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We need more information. There's still too much we don't know." The next day, Ethan met with a lawyer who had handled surrogacy agreements. He needed to understand how this could have happened and what Natalie had really done. The lawyer confirmed Kara's story. Natalie had entered into a surrogacy agreement with a wealthy couple. But after the pregnancy began, she had backed out, deciding she couldn't go through with it. The couple had been furious, but there was nothing they could legally do to force her to comply. Ethan clenched his fists as he listened. So, you're saying Grace could have been part of this surrogacy arrangement? The lawyer nodded. It's possible. But without more documentation, it's hard to say for sure. Ethan felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over him. Natalie had lied to him. She had been carrying another couple's child, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at Grace as she slept peacefully in her crib. His emotions were a whirlwind: anger, sadness, and overwhelming confusion. He had loved Natalie with everything he had, and now he felt like he didn't know her at all. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Why didn't you tell me, Natalie? Why did you keep this from me?" He looked at Grace, feeling the pull of fatherhood stronger than ever, but also feeling a deep sense of betrayal. He wasn't sure what to do next. Could he still be her father, knowing that she had been part of a plan Natalie had kept from him? Could he move forward, or would this betrayal destroy everything? As the emotions overwhelmed him, Ethan broke down, tears streaming down his face. The weight of the secrets Natalie had left behind was too much to bear. He didn't know if he could continue being Grace's father, if he even had the right. Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Grace lay peacefully in her crib, unaware of the chaos surrounding her existence. After days of soul-searching, Ethan had come to a decision. Whether Grace was biologically his or not didn't matter anymore. She was his daughter in every way that counted. He couldn't walk away. "I'm not going to let them take you," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence. His love for Grace had become the anchor that steadied him in this storm of revelations. The doorbell rang, and Ethan found Sarah waiting on the other side. "You look determined," she said, stepping inside. "Have you decided?" Ethan nodded. "I'm going to fight for her. I don't care what Natalie did. Grace is my daughter." Sarah smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. "That's the Ethan I know. We'll fight this no matter what." As Ethan prepared for the legal battle ahead, complications quickly arose. The wealthy couple from Natalie's surrogacy agreement had surfaced, claiming they had a right to Grace. They were well-connected and willing to use their resources to challenge Ethan's custody. "Do they have a case?" Ethan asked his lawyer, a stern man named David Harris, as they sat in his office. David leaned back in his chair. "It's complicated. If they can prove Natalie entered into a legal surrogacy contract, they might have a claim. But it's also murky because Natalie backed out before any final agreements were signed." Ethan clenched his fists. "But Grace isn't theirs. She's mine." David nodded. "I know. We're going to fight this, but be prepared. They're going to throw everything they have at us." Ethan left the office with a heavy heart. He wasn't just battling for custody of Grace. He was fighting against the possibility of losing her forever. The courtroom was sterile, the air thick with tension. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, Sarah by his side for moral support. Across from him sat the wealthy couple, Edward and Amelia Danvers, their expressions calm, as though they had already won. Ethan's stomach churned. "Your Honor," Edward's lawyer began, "my clients entered into a legal surrogacy agreement with Natalie Pierce. They have every right to claim custody of the child, as per their agreement." Ethan's lawyer, David, stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the child in question, Grace, is not biologically related to the Danvers. Moreover, Natalie Pierce terminated any potential surrogacy agreement before any procedures were completed." Edward Danvers spoke up, his voice smooth. "We were promised a child, Your Honor. This baby is as much ours as anyone's." Ethan stood, his heart pounding. "She's mine. Grace is biologically my daughter." The judge looked at Ethan. "We'll need more evidence to prove that claim." David nodded. "We request a second DNA test, Your Honor. The results will prove Mr. Cole's paternity beyond a shadow of a doubt." Ethan's heart raced as he sat in the hospital once again, awaiting the results of the second DNA test. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "I hate this waiting," he muttered. Sarah nodded. "We're going to get through this, Ethan. You're doing the right thing." A nurse entered the room, holding an envelope. "Here are the results," she said, handing it to Ethan. His hands shook as he opened it. The words on the page made his heart stop. Positive match. Grace was biologically his, just as the first test had shown. Sarah squeezed his arm. "Ethan, this is it. This is the proof you need." Ethan stared at the paper, overwhelmed with relief and disbelief. How was this possible? How could Grace be his biological daughter when Natalie had been involved in a surrogacy agreement? "There's more to this," Ethan said, his voice low. "But right now, I have to focus on keeping her." Back in court, the results of the DNA retest were presented. The room fell silent as the judge reviewed the document. The Danvers couple sat in stunned silence, their confidence visibly shaken. David stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the DNA test proves that Grace is biologically related to my client, Ethan Cole. Any claims made by the Danvers are now void. There is no legal ground for them to take custody." The judge nodded, his gaze shifting toward Edward and Amelia. "Given this new evidence, I see no reason to continue this custody dispute." But just as Ethan began to breathe a sigh of relief, the Danvers lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we believe the DNA test raises even more questions. If Grace is biologically Mr. Cole's, how did she come to be part of the surrogacy arrangement?" The courtroom fell silent again. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized they were right. There was still a mystery to solve. The judge turned to Ethan. "We'll need further investigation into this matter. But for now, custody remains with Mr. Cole." Ethan felt the weight of the moment. He had won the battle for Grace, but the twisted truth behind her origins was far from resolved. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Ethan sat beside his lawyer, David, as the judge prepared to give his final ruling. Across from him, the Danvers couple sat stone-faced, their confidence shaken after the DNA test results. Ethan's heart raced, knowing this moment would decide his and Grace's future. The judge cleared his throat. "After reviewing all the evidence, including the DNA test that proves Grace is biologically Ethan Cole's daughter, I see no grounds for the Danvers' claim to custody." Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, though the reality of the battle they had fought lingered. The judge continued, "Mr. Cole, you are granted full custody of Grace." David gave him a reassuring nod, and Ethan felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had won. Grace was his. But even with the victory, there was still a sense of loss and confusion. What had really happened with Natalie? Later that evening, Ethan sat in his apartment, watching Grace sleep peacefully in her crib. The glow of the nightlight cast soft shadows on her face. His heart ached as memories of Natalie flooded his mind. He had loved her deeply, but now, he was left with more questions than answers. "I wish you'd told me, Natalie," he whispered into the quiet room. Sarah had stopped by earlier to check on him, and they'd talked briefly about the court's decision. "Do you think she was scared?" Ethan had asked her. Sarah had nodded. "It sounds like Natalie was trying to protect you, and maybe herself. She made choices out of fear, and we'll never fully understand why." Ethan leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. He wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Sad that Natalie had been so scared that she couldn't tell him the truth. Sad that their future had been stolen by secrets. But most of all, sad that she had carried this burden alone. In the days that followed, Ethan worked to finalize Grace's adoption. The court ruling had been in his favor, but there were still legalities to handle. As he sat in the adoption office, signing papers, he felt a sense of closure begin to form. The chaos of the past months was finally settling. The adoption official smiled as she handed him the final documents. "Congratulations, Mr. Cole. It's official now. Grace is your daughter, in every way that matters." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion as he held the papers. He had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was real. Grace was his. Not just legally, but emotionally. He had found his purpose again. He left the office, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The future no longer seemed daunting. It felt hopeful. Back at home, Ethan picked Grace up from her crib and held her close. "It's just you and me now," he whispered, smiling down at her. "We're going to be okay." He had decided to honor Natalie's memory, not by holding onto the pain of her secrets, but by giving Grace the life she deserved. A life filled with love, stability, and a father who would never leave her. Ethan set Grace down in her playpen and sat on the floor beside her. She gurgled happily, her tiny fingers reaching for his. He marveled at how much had changed since the day he found her in that alley. She had become the light in his life, the reason he had fought through all the pain and uncertainty. "I love you, Grace," he said softly, "and I promise I'll always be here for you." A few weeks later, Ethan and Grace visited the park for the first time since the court ruling. The air was crisp, the sun shining brightly overhead. As they strolled through the park, Ethan watched Grace giggle at the passing birds, her joy infectious. He thought about how far they had come, from the abandoned baby he had found to the daughter who had given him a new purpose. Despite the heartbreak, the secrets, and the battles they had faced, Ethan knew that this was where he was meant to be, with Grace. They stopped by the playground, and Ethan lifted Grace from her stroller, holding her hand as they walked toward the swings. As he pushed her gently, her laughter filled the air, and Ethan couldn't help but smile. He looked around the park, watching other families, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Grace had changed his life in ways he never expected, and despite everything, he wouldn't trade it for anything. As they walked hand in hand toward the sunset, Ethan knew that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They were a family now, and nothing could change that.